This is Barcelona, and this is Beijing. These two cities could not be more different in culture, in language, and in history. But comparing them reveals something universal, the most important concept in all of urban design. Now, before we get into praising one city that is brilliantly designed and another one that I'm going to have some very harsh words for, we're going to need to build some important context on how city organization is the way it is today, for better or for worse. Humans have been gathering in settlements since time immemorial. As these settlements grew, people realized that organizing the places where they lived and worked was essential for efficient land use and allowing for circulation. One of the earliest known examples of organized urban planning comes from the Mohenjo-daro in the Indus Valley, which featured a rectilinear street grid, standardized brick sizes, and an advanced drainage system. Later, the Greek city of Miletus became a model for grid-based urban design, influencing countless cities in the Hellenistic world. In the Roman era, cities such as Timgad in modern-day Algeria used a strict orthogonal grid. This became a template for Roman colonies across Europe and North Africa. Over the centuries, cities evolved from these early patterns into new forms that reflect the priorities, technologies, and values of their time. Now, to have a shared understanding, I have loosely categorized common city organization types into 5 different city grid types. Number 1, the organic and unplanned layout. In this organization, we see city streets and alleys that have evolved organically and layered over centuries, like we see in Venice, Italy. In this grid type, we almost always see narrow streets that bend and contort in seemingly arbitrary ways, lined by small buildings with a mix of uses typically. Number 2, the orthogonal rectilinear grid. Blocks are strictly rectilinear or square, like we see in Manhattan, New York. The rectilinear blocks allow for easy navigation and land subdivision, and it's also very easy to design and build. Number 3, the radial circular grid. Streets spread outward from a central point, often layered with concentric circles. This can create dramatic vistas and emphasize hierarchy of space, but is more challenging for navigation and irregular parceling compared to rectilinear grids, making it harder to subdivide. Few cities follow this pattern perfectly, but Moscow, Russia comes closer than most. Number 4, the radial grid hybrid. This is a combination of the last 2 grid types, the typical traditional right angle orthogonal grid system with radial avenues that cut diagonally through the city. These typically radiate outward from a focal point like we see in Washington, D.C. While this grid type typically creates an intriguing hierarchy of avenues and spaces, it is a generally less efficient option than the ones that we've seen prior. And the last grid type, number 5, the hierarchical road network. The typical characteristics of this pattern is arterial roads with smaller streets connecting that do not allow for parallel movement between the smaller streets, like cul-de-sacs. We see this in suburban areas throughout the United States. Now, with that shared lens of understanding of city organization, let's look at the key ingredient of what makes one city an amazing place for human habitation and why another one is failing completely. Beijing, the historic capital of China, has its roots stretching back over 3,000 years. The old city core of Beijing, much of which took shape during the Ming Dynasty, in the 15th century, much consideration was given to how big people are, and in comparison, how large the buildings are. And there's typically a relationship where the people don't feel alienated by the size of the buildings because they're quite a relatable size. The streets in this area are narrow enough to cross easily, and the distance between intersections is short enough to give pedestrians frequent choices to change directions and explore. Here in a street view, we see the streets are very small, with a limited amount of vehicles, The roads are curved and give you a sense of discovery as you walk down them. Even the streets appear to be residential side streets, have so many shops and restaurants that can be discovered, which is why people are drawn to these old cities. That and this area of Beijing has amazing street food to eat as you walk down the streets. But Beijing did not remain frozen in time. In the mid-20th century, it was a city of roughly 1.6 million people. By the early 21st century, it had exploded to over 21 million residents, a population boom that happened in just 70 years. And much of this growth came from rural migrants seeking opportunities in the capital. The city looked at the old city streets and deemed them inefficient for modern life. So, to accommodate a massive influx of new residences, vast new districts were built, and on a completely different scale and design philosophy. What Beijing came up with was something completely alien to the old city. The new districts of the capital would be designed with strict orthogonal grids, with massive roads and giant city blocks. These mega blocks are often developed and owned by a single entity, resulting in large, uniform superstructures instead of fine-grained mix of shops, residences that we see in the historic core. Now businesses are typically separated from residential developments. Most neighborhood shops and retail went to the neighborhood mall. With this standard approach to planning, all developments in the city started to look and feel exactly the same. The typical residential development became as follows: a large private garden surrounded by an array of identical skyscrapers surrounded by walls. Because this area was designed for people to use cars, and cars can cover large distances quickly, the new Beijing blocks are enormous by pedestrian standards, often stretching several hundred meters between intersections. Good luck crossing at the intersections because the roads are so wide, sometimes about 10 to 12 lanes wide, that many just have a bridge for pedestrians to walk across. While Beijing does have a robust and expanding metro network, the street-level urban design in newer areas often feel disconnected from it, almost as if no one told the city planners that people still need to walk the last mile between the station and their final destination. And you can imagine, for someone on foot, these distances can feel daunting and discourage walking altogether. The grid is extremely strict, in keeping with this rectilinear grid, and never allows for any interesting variation that could break up the monotony. You will walk in a straight line, and you have no choice ever, leading to a very drab and soulless experience. Here we can see a comparison of old Beijing to new Beijing. The difference in scale is quite shocking. So here we are looking at a street level view. Fun fact, this is pretty close to where I used to live in Beijing, and I would walk this area quite a bit. You can see the walls, and they look like they go on forever. And just look at those giant repeating towers. It makes me feel like I'm making no progress in space as I'm walking. So it's a really frustrating experience. Here we are at an intersection, and just look how enormous this road is. It's basically a highway. It takes a very long time to cross, so it's a very bad experience. Beijing's growth left it with massive blocks and soulless super districts. But what if there was another way? Another city that faced the same challenge of expansion, but found a solution that balanced modern needs with human scale design. For that, we turn to Barcelona. To pause for 5 seconds, if this subject matter interests you, please drop a like, as it does help the channel, and please consider subscribing to see more just like this. Now back to the video. Barcelona's origins trace back to being a Roman colony, founded around 15 BCE. Some of its original street organization, particularly in the Gothic quarter, still survives to this day. It is characterized by its narrow, small-scale neighborhood streets and organically interlocking layout of grids and buildings. Here in the Gothic quarter of Barcelona, there are major differences between the details and materials that we saw in the historic area of Beijing, but we can start to see the similarities. The small-scale roads that sometimes are winding and it's hard to see the end of. This creates a mystery that lies ahead. It makes you want to explore and discover as you're walking. It's easy to see why people love visiting these kind of areas. We can see that these buildings just aren't easy to build anymore. They are not accessible, they have uneven levels, the windows are irregular, custom made. They're very difficult to build compared to a square or rectilinear building. Now let's zoom out to the Barcelona I think most people are familiar with. This is the modern city of Barcelona that we recognize today. It was shaped by the visionary urban planner Ildefons Cerdà. I probably butchered that name. This, of course, is from his 1859 plan. His design introduced a square or orthogonal grid of streets, which we saw an example of earlier. The blocks have chamfered corners, which softens the rectilinear blocks, and all this is supported by a hierarchy of neighborhood streets and broad avenues. Generally, blocks of 9 are grouped together. These are called superblocks, and they have a small-scale street in between them, and they are surrounded by these large avenues that go around these blocks of 9. The occasional diagonal street cuts through these blocks, breaking up the monotony of the square grid, and this opens up view corridors to important monuments or public spaces in the city, but it does generally keep to this block of 9. Let's look at why this is such a masterclass in design. These blocks are a typical 113 meters wide. To compare that to the block sizes in Manhattan, their block sizes vary a little bit, but typically they're around 80 meters by 274 meters. This means that in any direction you walk, you only have to walk a short distance to get to the next intersection, and you feel like you're making progress moving through space because of this. The block sizes are wide enough to accommodate double-loaded residential buildings, arranged with a typical central courtyard. By allowing courtyards to be built in the middle of their blocks, this not only allows for natural light and ventilation into homes, this provides a shared green space for residents. And looking from the street view, the variety of buildings is also a really nice feature. Each block was developed by multiple owners, and we can see the contrast of that to Beijing. When it's just one developer, you get a lot of monotony. When you have a bunch of different developers or owners or people throughout history building buildings for themselves, you get a lot of unique storefronts and a lot of unique details, which, while being organizationally different than the Gothic quarter, you still have that richness of experience as a pedestrian. And here we can see the experience as a pedestrian. The length of the block is short enough that walking feels comfortable, giving pedestrians frequent opportunities to change direction, explore side streets, and discover new parts of the city without feeling trapped in a long, monotonous stretch. If you walk these streets, there is so much you can discover along the way. And it's the size of the blocks that is giving us that feeling. There may be less opportunities to change direction and explore, like in the Gothic quarter, but the new grid section of the city allows for better living spaces to be built, and the roads allow for utilities to be more convenient for a modern way of life. So Cerdà's plan strikes quite a nice balance of beauty and functionality, and this is why Cerdà's grid remains one of the most influential examples of balancing order, beauty, and human experience in urban design. So what is the most important thing to consider when organizing a city? Well, it's a balancing act. Blocks can't be so narrow that they prevent efficient, modern building layouts, but they also can't be so large that they alienate the people at the street level. Streets should have variation to reduce monotony, but not confuse those traveling through the city. And yes, the block type or grid type does have an influence on how one feels when they are walking through a city. And at a later date, we can really get into which grid type is better. But it's the size of the blocks that influence how a person feels about a city more than any other ingredient. Barcelona is proof that you can get the best of both worlds. Beijing shows that when you take all the human elements out of a city that people love, the result is very hard to stomach. If a city's priority is to move cars as fast as possible, then giant, soulless superblocks will do the job. But if the goal is to enhance human experience, to make streets vibrant, walkable, and full of life, then blocks should be small enough to encourage walking, but also, of course, wide enough to support life within. The design of cities have quite an effect on all of us. I think the Danish urban designer Jan Gehl said it best. First we shape the cities, then they shape us. Thank you all for watching.